The fire started as a whisper of smoke, curling up from a neglected power coupling in the adjacent housing pod. A subtle flicker of orange danced in the distance, almost unnoticeable against the dim, violet hues of Gorvain's evening skies. But in moments, the flicker grew hungry, consuming the brittle biofiber walls that lined the settlement. By the time Zeryl caught the acrid scent of burning polymer, it was too late. Her violet-toned skin glistened under the meager glow of the cooking station's dim lights. The evening meal simmered quietly, filling the pod with the familiar, comforting aroma of Gorvanian root stew. Vaxel, her 6-year-old daughter, sat cross-legged on the woven floor mat, her tiny lavender eyes focused intently on arranging colored stones in neat little rows. Then the tremor hit. It wasn't an earthquake, but the force rattled their fragile pod enough to send plates clattering to the ground. Zeryl froze, her frilled ears twitching, attuned to the low rumble in the distance. A second thud followed, louder, closer. Vaxel, she called sharply, her voice low but urgent. The little girl glanced up, her soft purple frills fluttering in confusion. "What was that, Mama?" "Come here now," Zeryl said, scooping the girl up and clutching her against her chest. Her frills twitched again, this time catching the faintest tang of smoke. She rushed to the narrow window slit carved into the pod's wall, her heart tightening at the sight outside. The fire was no longer a distant glow. It roared now, a wall of violent orange devouring everything in its path. Embers leapt skyward, carried by gusts of hot wind, while thick black smoke coiled upward, choking the air. Zeryl's pulse raced. The settlement's fragile, biofiber-built structures ignited like dry leaves. Gorvanian architecture prioritized harmony with nature. Lightweight, biodegradable, and easily assembled. But in moments like this, it was a curse. Their homes burned fast and hot, offering no resistance to the blaze. Desperation clawed at her chest as she pounded on the warped glass of the window. Outside, shadows of neighbors flitted past in the glow, their figures blurred by smoke. Zeryl screamed, her voice cracking, "Help us! My daughter's inside!" No one stopped. Some turned to glance at her, their wide eyes filled with something between fear and regret. But no one moved closer. Gorvanians weren't risk-takers. Their society prized caution, their survival instincts honed toward preservation over action. Even in the face of a life-threatening inferno, they stood rooted to the spot, murmuring among themselves but refusing to intervene. "Mama, what's happening?" Vaxel whimpered, her small fingers digging into Zeryl's shoulder. Zeryl swallowed hard, forcing calm into her voice. "We'll be fine, my love. Stay close to me." But the lie tasted bitter. She tugged at the pod door, but the heat had warped it, sealing them inside. The smoke thickened, filling the small space, stinging her eyes and throat. She coughed violently, clutching Vaxel tighter. Panic clawed at her mind, but she shoved it down, trying to think. She scanned the room for something, anything to tool a way out. But nothing in their humble pod could match the intensity of the flames. The walls grew hot to the touch, and the air seemed to shimmer with the heat. Vaxel sobbed into her shoulder. "Mama, I'm scared." Zeryl pressed her forehead to the child's. "I know, sweetheart. Me too." And then, a loud crash shattered the sound of crackling flames. The door slammed open with a violent jolt, the warped frame bursting apart under the force of a well-placed kick. Smoke poured in, swirling angrily, and through the haze stepped a figure, massive, hulking, and entirely out of place. Zeryl blinked, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The man who entered was human, his tall frame clad in heavy black fabric scorched at the edges. His pale skin was streaked with soot, and his eyes, piercing blue, cut through the smoky air with a clarity that made her shudder. He pulled a tattered sleeve up over his nose and stepped inside, his movements quick and purposeful. "Get up," he barked, his voice gravelly but commanding. "We're leaving." Zeryl instinctively backed away, clutching Vaxel protectively. "Who are you?" she rasped, her throat raw from smoke. "Frank," he said shortly, his gaze scanning the pod. You've got 2 minutes before this place collapses. Give me the kid." "No!" Zeryl snapped, her frills flaring in alarm. "She's my daughter, and she's going to die if you don't let me get her out of here." Frank shot back, his tone sharp but calm. He stepped closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow across the room. "Look, I'm faster, I'm stronger, and I've done this before. You want her to live? Hand her over." Zeryl hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of fear and doubt. But the walls groaned ominously, and Vaxel coughed again, her little body trembling. With a choked sob, Zeryl relented, holding her daughter out. Frank took the child with surprising gentleness, wrapping her in his jacket to shield her from the heat. He met Zeryl's eyes. "Stay close. And keep low." He moved like a force of nature, bulldozing through the smoke-filled corridor with Vaxel tucked securely against his chest. Zeryl followed, her legs burning as she scrambled to keep up. Flaming debris rained down around them, and the heat grew unbearable. At one point, a section of the ceiling caved in, blocking their path. Frank didn't stop. He shifted Vaxel to one arm and used his free hand to shove the flaming wreckage aside, muscles straining as he cleared the way. "Move!" he barked, not even glancing back. They burst into the open air moments later, coughing and gasping. The cool night breeze was a shocking contrast to the suffocating heat. Frank set Vaxel down carefully, stepping back as Zeryl fell to her knees, pulling her daughter into her arms. Around them, the crowd of Gorvanians stood in stunned silence. Their wide eyes flicked between the burning wreckage and the soot-covered human who had defied every societal expectation. Frank straightened, wiping sweat and ash from his face, his expression unreadable. "You're welcome," he muttered, his voice laced with sarcasm. Then he turned, walking away without another word. Zeryl stared after him, her heart pounding. She didn't know who he was or why he'd risked himself for strangers. But one thing was certain. That human was unlike anyone she'd ever encountered. The fire roared behind them, an angry beast devouring all it touched. Zeryl stumbled out of the smoldering ruins, clutching Vaxel against her chest. She dropped to her knees on the cool, compacted dirt, her violet skin streaked with soot, her lungs aching with every breath. She barely registered the murmuring crowd around them, their passive stares heavy with discomfort. Their inaction burned in her mind more than the flames ever could. The pod she had called home, her sanctuary, was gone, reduced to ash and embers in a matter of minutes. Through the haze of her despair, Zeryl glanced toward the man who had torn them from the brink of death. Frank stood a few feet away, his imposing frame silhouetted against the glow of the inferno. He was battered, his clothes charred and torn, but he moved with unrelenting purpose, running a hand through his soot-dusted hair, as if the ordeal had been nothing more than an inconvenience. He turned to Zeryl, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "She okay?" he asked, jerking his chin toward Vaxel. Zeryl nodded stiffly, though her voice caught in her throat. She tried to speak, to thank him, but the words refused to come. Instead, she looked down at Vaxel, who clung to her with trembling hands, her lavender eyes glassy with shock. Frank crouched beside them, his movements deliberate but not unkind. He kept his distance, though his presence was impossible to ignore. "She's breathing fine. No burns. Just scared." His tone was brusque, but not heartless. Zeryl's frills twitched with unease. "You sound experienced." Frank exhaled sharply, his lips pulling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Experience doesn't make it easier," he replied, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful. "But it gets people out alive." Zeryl stiffened, unsure how to respond. Before she could form a coherent thought, Frank rose abruptly, brushing ash from his pants. He turned toward the crowd, his gaze sweeping across their frozen faces. "Anyone got a spare pod these two can use?" His voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Or are you all just going to stand there and gawk?" The onlookers shifted uncomfortably, their frills curling in what passed for embarrassment among Gorvanians. One of them, an older male with a drooping posture, stepped forward. "Our shelters are modest. Limited capacity. It would be challenging. Challenging." Frank repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief. She's got a kid. You're seriously going to let them sleep in the dirt? The man faltered, his gaze dropping. Others began to drift away, muttering about the danger being over, about responsibilities elsewhere. One by one, they dispersed, leaving Zeril and Frank alone with the crackling remnants of her home. Zeril's chest tightened. Shame, frustration, and exhaustion warred within her. They won't help, she said quietly, her voice brittle. It's not their way. Frank's jaw clenched. Their way sucks. She almost laughed, almost, but her exhaustion stole the sound before it could escape. She adjusted Vaxel in her arms and struggled to her feet. Thank you for what you did, she said, her words halting but sincere. I owe you. You don't, Frank replied quickly. I saw someone in trouble. That's it. He crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. Where are you going to go? Zeril hesitated. The truth tasted bitter in her mouth. I don't know. Frank grunted, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, figured as much. He looked down at Vaxel, who peered up at him with wide, curious eyes. Something shifted in his expression, an almost imperceptible softening. Come on, he said finally. You can't stay out here all night. Zeril blinked. What do you mean? There's a storage shack near the outskirts, he said, nodding toward the settlement's edge. Not much, but it's got a roof. Better than nothing. Her instincts screamed at her to refuse. He was a stranger, an off-worlder, a man whose intentions she couldn't read. But the weight of Vaxel in her arms and the sight of the charred ruins behind her left little room for pride. She nodded reluctantly. Lead the way. The shack was little more than a skeletal frame with walls patched together from mismatched scraps of metal and plastic. Inside, it was dark and dusty, but it was dry. Frank nudged open the flimsy door with his boot and stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter first. Zeril hesitated on the threshold, her frills twitching with unease. This is yours? Found it, Frank said, his tone casual. No one claimed it, so I figured why not. He leaned against the doorframe, watching as she stepped inside. I'll grab some stuff to make it livable. You stay put. Wait, Zeril called as he turned to leave. He paused, his broad shoulders stiffening slightly. Why are you helping us? She asked, her voice laced with suspicion. You don't even know us. Frank glanced back, his expression hard to read in the dim light. Don't think too hard about it, he said. Not everyone needs a reason to do the right thing. He didn't wait for her response, disappearing into the night with the same abruptness that seemed to define him. Zeril stood there, holding Vaxel close, her mind spinning. The human had saved them without hesitation. Now he was offering them shelter. But as the fire's embers cooled outside and the quiet of the shack settled around her, she couldn't help but wonder, what kind of man walks into a burning building for strangers and expects nothing in return? The sound of rain woke Zeril before the first light of Gorvain's twin moons. Thin rivulets slipped through cracks in the shack's patched roof, streaking the rusted walls. She sat up slowly, her muscles aching from the previous day's ordeal. The faint hum of the portable heater provided the only warmth in the otherwise damp and cold space. Beside her, Vaxel was still curled up under the coarse blanket Frank had found for them. The child's soft lavender skin glowed faintly in the dim light, her breathing steady, though her small frame trembled occasionally in sleep. Zeril touched her daughter's forehead, reassuring herself she wasn't feverish. She envied Vaxel's ability to find peace so easily, even after the chaos. But for Zeril, the events of the fire played on repeat in her mind. The panic, the heat, the helplessness, and, finally, the human who had burst into their lives like a force of nature. Frank was an anomaly, not just in appearance but in presence. His size and strength were intimidating enough, but his actions were what unsettled her most. Gorvanian society didn't breed heroes. Self-sacrifice was considered reckless, even foolish. Yet Frank had risked his life without hesitation, then stayed to ensure their survival. Zeril didn't know what to make of him. The sound of the door creaking open startled her. Frank stepped inside, his tall frame briefly outlined against the silver glow of the moons before the door shut behind him. He carried a bundle of supplies wrapped in a tattered cloth and a sharp chill of night air clung to him. "Morning," he said, his voice low and rough. He set the bundle on the floor and began unpacking it. A small stack of food rations, a few tools, and a battered pot. His movements were methodical, his expression unreadable. Zeryl's frills twitched, a mix of unease and curiosity. "You been out all night?" "Had to," he replied, not looking at her. "Figured you might want more than just a roof over your head." The statement carried no pride, no implication that she owed him anything. It was simple and direct, like everything else about him. That bluntness unsettled her almost as much as it reassured her. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, folding her hands tightly in her lap. "We could have managed." Frank snorted, crouching to inspect the portable heater. "Sure, until the next storm rolls in and this shack falls apart." Her frills stiffened. "This isn't our first hardship, you know. I've kept Vaxel safe for years without your help." Frank glanced up, one eyebrow raised. "And you'll keep her safe better with it. That's the difference." The sharpness of his words stung, but they weren't cruel. He didn't speak to belittle her, only to state what he saw as plain truth. Still, Zeryl felt her pride flare, even as she knew he was right. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. "What do you gain from helping us?" Frank straightened, his expression hard to read in the dim light. "What does it matter?" "It matters to me," she pressed, her voice firmer now. "Humans don't just give without expecting something in return, do they?" A flicker of something, annoyance, maybe amusement, crossed his face. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "Most humans are selfish. But not all of us. Sometimes you see someone in trouble and do the right thing. Doesn't need to be more complicated than that." Zeryl studied him, her mind turning over his words. They didn't fully satisfy her, but she could sense there was more he wasn't saying. Perhaps he didn't trust her enough to share it. Or perhaps he didn't want to face whatever truth lay beneath his own actions. The rest of the morning passed in a tense sort of calm. Frank busied himself reinforcing the shack, patching holes in the walls and fixing a leaky corner of the roof. His movements were efficient, almost mechanical, as if physical labor was a language he spoke fluently. Zeryl watched him work, her frills occasionally twitching in bemusement. He had a way of moving that was utterly alien to her, deliberate yet unrefined, with a raw energy that seemed to pulse beneath his skin. Gorvanians were graceful by nature, their motions precise and calculated. Frank, by contrast, was a storm in human form. At one point, Vaxel woke and toddled over to him, her small hands clutching the edge of his jacket. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice small but curious. "Fixing your roof," Frank replied without missing a beat. He didn't smile, but his tone softened, a subtle shift that Zeryl noticed immediately. "Why?" Vaxel tilted her head, her lavender eyes wide. "Because it's broken," he said simply. "And you shouldn't have to sleep under a broken roof." Vaxel seemed to consider this, then nodded as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. She stayed by his side after that, watching him work with the rapt attention only a child could muster. Frank didn't shoo her away, though he occasionally muttered warnings to keep her fingers clear of his tools. As the day wore on, Zeryl found herself relaxing slightly in Frank's presence. He didn't pry into her life or ask for anything in return. Instead, he quietly ensured they had what they needed, his actions speaking louder than any words could. Still, she couldn't shake the lingering question of why. His earlier explanation, that he had simply done what was right, felt incomplete. There was a weight to him, a shadow in his eyes that hinted at a deeper story. "Frank," she said that evening as they sat around the portable heater, the meager warmth doing little to dispel the chill. "What happened with your crew? The ones who left you here?" He looked up sharply, his expression hardening. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "They got scared, took a job that went south, and they figured dumping me would save their skins." Zeryl frowned. "But why you? Were you dangerous to them?" Frank let out a dry laugh. "Dangerous? No, just inconvenient. I don't run when things get messy, and they didn't want the trouble of sticking around." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. For the first time, Zeryl glimpsed the man beneath the armor, a man shaped by betrayal and loss, yet still willing to stand in the fire for strangers. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, and she meant it. Frank shrugged. "Don't be. I'm better off without them." But the way his gaze drifted to the floor told her otherwise. As night fell, the shack felt less like a shelter and more like a home, however temporary. Vaxel drifted to sleep in Zeryl's lap, her small hands clutching the edge of her mother's tunic. Frank sat nearby, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, his eyes half closed but alert. Zeryl watched him for a long moment, her frills twitching thoughtfully. She still didn't fully understand him, and perhaps she never would. But for now, she was grateful, and that was enough. "Thank you," she said softly. Frank's eyes opened, his gaze meeting hers. He didn't reply, but he nodded once, the faintest ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Outside, the rain continued to fall, its steady rhythm a reminder that the world moved on, indifferent to their struggles. But inside the shack, for the first time in days, Zeryl felt a fragile sense of hope. The metallic clang of tools hitting the floor startled Zeryl. She turned quickly, her violet frills flaring with alarm. Frank stood at the entrance of the shack, balancing a rusted toolbox in one hand and a bundle of scavenged materials in the other. His disheveled appearance, sweat-matted hair, soot-streaked clothes, and a slight limp made it clear he'd been busy. "You look worse than yesterday," Zeryl said, her voice sharp but tinged with concern. Frank shrugged and stepped inside, setting the items down with a grunt. "I'm not here to win beauty contests." Zeryl rolled her eyes but said nothing. Frank had spent the past 2 days working relentlessly, venturing into the settlement and its outskirts to scrounge for anything useful. He repaired the shack bit by bit, patching its leaky roof and reinforcing its brittle walls. His stubbornness baffled her. Gorvanians didn't extend effort without reason, and humans weren't exactly known for altruism. "Found some decent panels," Frank said, motioning to the pile of warped but salvageable scrap. "Not pretty, but they'll hold if another storm hits." Zeryl studied him, folding her arms. "Why do you keep doing this? You've done more than enough." Frank wiped his hands on his pants and leaned against the wall. "What do you want me to say? That I got some grand plan? I don't." "Then why?" she pressed, her voice rising. "Why go through so much trouble for people you don't even know?" Frank's gaze hardened. "Because someone should." His answer left her momentarily speechless. Gorvanian culture prized balance and caution. Risking one's life, resources, or time for others disrupted that equilibrium, making such actions rare. Frank's bluntness didn't match their values, but his actions, selfless and unyielding, were difficult to dismiss. Outside, the settlement was beginning to rebuild. Though many Gorvanians had lost their homes in the fire, their society's collective nature kicked in quickly. Neighbors shared resources, while the settlement's overseers coordinated the repair efforts. But Zeryl had noticed something peculiar. Despite their outward efficiency, the community still avoided her family. Guilt, she realized, none of them had moved to help during the fire. Now their guilt had morphed into an awkward distance, as if proximity to her would force them to confront their own inaction. Frank seemed oblivious to the social nuances, or perhaps he just didn't care. He carried on with his work, indifferent to the occasional glances or whispers as he passed. By mid-afternoon, Vaxel had taken to following him like a shadow. The little girl held a bent piece of metal she decided was her tool, and mimicked Frank's every move, much to his feigned irritation. "You're going to hurt yourself doing that," he grumbled as she poked the scrap against a cracked panel. "I'm fixing it," Vaxel said, her voice confident. "Like you." Frank smirked despite himself. "Kid, if you're fixing anything, it's with bad technique." "I'll get better," she replied, her tone stubborn. Zeryl watched the exchange from a distance, her heart caught between gratitude and apprehension. Frank wasn't gentle, but his gruff manner seemed to resonate with Vaxel, who hadn't laughed this much in weeks. Later that evening, the shack's interior was warm, thanks to the portable heater Frank had salvaged. Zeryl and Vaxel sat side by side, sharing a meal of rehydrated rations. Frank sat across from them, inspecting a broken circuit board he'd found. "You don't talk about yourself much," Zeril said suddenly. Frank didn't look up. What's there to say? Plenty, she countered. Where you're from, what brought you here, anything. Frank sighed, setting the circuit board aside. Earth, he said after a moment. That's where I'm from. Not much to say about it now. The planet's fine, but the people? Messy. Zeril raised an eyebrow. And you're not. I'm human, he admitted with a wry smile. Messy by default. Vaxel giggled, earning a rare, softer glance from Frank. Zeril leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. And Gorvain? How'd you end up here? Bad decisions, he replied. His tone was light, but his expression darkened. Took a job with people I shouldn't have trusted. When it went sideways, they decided I was expendable. Zeril frowned. And you've been here ever since? Pretty much, he said. I was ready to move on. But then your place caught fire. His words carried more weight than she expected. And that stopped you? Frank met her gaze. Would have stopped you too. Zeril hesitated, the truth of his statement silencing her. She hadn't considered it before, but in Frank's place, she might have done the same. His actions were brash, yes, but not incomprehensible. He didn't overthink, he acted. That raw decisiveness was both alien and strangely admirable. As night fell, Vaxel drifted off to sleep in her corner of the shack. Frank sat outside, leaning against the wall and staring at the sky. Zeril joined him, the cool air brushing against her skin. She sat beside him, unsure what to say. Gorvain's quiet, Frank said, breaking the silence. Too quiet, Zeril asked. He shrugged. Depends. Sometimes quiet's good. Other times, it's just lonely. The honesty in his voice surprised her. Is that how you feel here? Sometimes, he admitted. But it's not just this place. Been that way a long time. Zeril's frills twitched. She glanced at him, the lines of his face etched with something she hadn't noticed before. Weariness, not from physical labor, but from years of carrying invisible burdens. You could leave, you know, she said softly. Find another crew, another planet. Could he agreed. But you'd still be here, in this broken shack, trying to keep your kids safe. Zeril felt her chest tighten. She had been so consumed by her own survival that she hadn't stopped to think about how Frank's presence, strange as it was, had lessened the weight on her shoulders. I don't know if I trust you, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the breeze. Frank chuckled, though it lacked humor. Smart. You shouldn't. Trust gets you hurt. The words hung in the air, heavy with a truth neither could deny. Yet, for all his warnings, Zeril couldn't help but feel that the man beside her was someone worth trusting. Someone who had already risked everything for a family that wasn't his. And as they sat there under Gorvain's pale moons, the fragile beginnings of an unlikely bond began to take shape. Frank woke to the sound of raised voices. He sat up quickly, his instincts sharpened by years of uncertainty. The shack's interior was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the portable heater. Zeril and Vaxel were still asleep, curled together under their shared blanket. Frank listened closely, his sharp hearing picking up snippets of conversation from the direction of the settlement's central square. Burned faster than it should have. Sabotage? No, impossible. Who would do that? Things are getting worse. If the overseers don't act, we'll all. Frank's eyes narrowed. He slid his boots on and stepped outside, his movement careful to avoid waking Zeril and her daughter. The cool air carried the sharp tang of ash, a grim reminder of the fire that had destroyed so many homes. The settlement itself was eerily quiet except for the murmurs of a gathering a short distance away. He followed the voices, keeping to the shadows. The central square was crowded, a rare sight for a community that preferred privacy. Dozens of Gorvanians stood in tense clusters, their lavender frills twitching with unease. At the center of the commotion stood a tall figure Frank recognized. Artek, one of the settlement's overseers. Artek's robes, though clean and meticulously arranged, seemed ill-suited to the chaos around him. His voice carried an edge of authority, though it faltered under the weight of the crowd's questions. We are investigating the cause, Artek said, his tone strained. There is no evidence of foul play. No evidence because you haven't looked, a younger male shot back. The fire spread too fast. Those biofiber panels are flame-resistant. Someone tampered with them. Artek's frills stiffened, and his posture grew rigid. Do you hear yourself? Sabotage? This is a settlement of unity. Who among us would commit such a crime? That human's been lurking around, another voice said, cutting through the murmurs. Heads turned, and Frank felt the weight of their stares even from the shadows. I pulled two people out of that fire, Frank said loudly, stepping forward. The crowd parted as he approached, their wide eyes darting between him and Artek. If I wanted to burn this place down, I wouldn't have stuck around to clean up the mess. The tension in the square shifted, the whispers growing quieter. Frank stopped a few paces from Artek, his hands at his sides but ready. He met the overseer's gaze with an expression that dared him to push further. Artek cleared his throat. No one is accusing you outright, human, but your presence here is unorthodox. It raises questions. Frank raised an eyebrow. Unorthodox? That's a fancy way of saying inconvenient. Enough, Zeryl's voice rang out. Frank turned to see her approaching, her frills raised and her violet skin catching the light. She carried herself with a quiet authority that silenced the remaining whispers. Vaxel clung to her hand, peering out nervously from behind her mother. This man saved my daughter's life, Zeryl said firmly, her voice unwavering. If you want to waste time pointing fingers, do it somewhere else. We have homes to rebuild. Artek hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he raised his hands in a placating gesture. No decisions will be made hastily. We will continue to investigate. That is all. The crowd began to disperse, though their unease lingered in the air. Frank exhaled slowly, his muscles still tense. Zeryl walked up to him, her expression tight. You didn't have to confront them, she said softly. They were already looking my way, he replied. Might as well get it over with. Later, back at the shack, Frank sat outside repairing a damaged tool, while Zeryl prepared their evening meal. Vaxel played nearby, arranging colorful stones in a pattern that only made sense to her. Why would someone sabotage the settlement? Zeryl asked, breaking the quiet. She kept her tone neutral, but Frank could hear the worry beneath it. Could be anything, he said, not looking up. Greed, revenge, power. Take your pick. Zeryl frowned. That doesn't make sense here. We don't work like that. Frank finally glanced at her. Every society has cracks. Maybe yours just hides them better. She didn't respond immediately, but her frills twitched, a sign of unease he was starting to recognize. If you're right, then we're more vulnerable than I thought. Frank nodded. Yeah, you are. Her gaze flicked to Vaxel, who was humming softly as she played. Zeryl's protective instincts were palpable, a shield she carried everywhere. Frank respected it, but he couldn't help wondering how long that shield could hold if something worse was brewing. Frank couldn't sleep. The air in the shack felt too still, too heavy. He stepped outside, letting the cool breeze clear his head. The settlement was quiet again, but he knew better than to trust the surface. Something wasn't right, and it gnawed at him. Can't sleep? Zeryl's voice startled him. She stepped out of the shack, wrapping a thin blanket around her shoulders. Too quiet, Frank said, leaning against the wall. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for something he couldn't name. Zeryl moved closer, her violet skin glowing faintly in the moonlight. She leaned against the wall beside him, her arms crossed against the chill. You think the fire was deliberate. Feels that way, he admitted. Doesn't mean I'm right, but it's worth keeping an eye out. Zeryl nodded, her frills twitching thoughtfully. If you're wrong, we rebuild. If you're right, what then? Then we figure out who's behind it, Frank said, his tone matter of fact. And we stop them. Zeryl looked at him, her lavender eyes searching his face. You talk like it's your responsibility. Maybe it is, he said. I'm here. Might as well do something useful. She smiled faintly, though her expression remained guarded. You're an odd one, Frank. Yeah, I get that a lot. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Zeryl's gaze drifted to the twin moons above, their silvery glow casting long shadows across the settlement. She felt a pang of longing for the stability she had lost, the life she had fought to build for Vaxel. But standing beside Frank, she felt something unexpected, a fragile, tentative sense of hope. "You've turned everything upside down," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of something she couldn't quite name. "Before you, I didn't think I'd ever rely on anyone again." Frank looked at her, his sharp features softened by the pale light. "I'm not exactly reliable," he said. "I'm just stubborn." "Maybe stubborn is what I needed," Zero replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank tilted his head, studying her. For all her grace and composure, there was vulnerability in her eyes, an openness he hadn't expected. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before brushing against hers. Her skin was cool and smooth, her frills fluttering lightly at the contact. Zero didn't pull away. Instead, she turned to face him fully, her lavender eyes locking onto his. "You could leave," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You don't owe us anything." "I know," Frank replied, his voice steady. "But I don't want to." For a moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them seemed to dissolve, replaced by something electric, something raw. Frank stepped closer, his larger frame towering over her, but never imposing. Zeril tilted her head upward, her expression a mix of curiosity and hesitation. "Frank," she began, but whatever she intended to say was lost as he leaned in, his lips brushing hers. The kiss was tentative at first, testing the waters of an unfamiliar connection. Zeril's frills quivered, and she responded, her hand sliding up to rest against his chest. The warmth of his skin contrasted with the cool night air, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. Frank deepened the kiss, his hand moving to the small of her back. His touch was firm yet careful, as if afraid she might break. Zeril leaned into him, her body pressing against his, her breath mingling with his in the quiet of the night. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads touched, both of them breathing heavily. Zeril's frills fluttered against his cheek, a subtle but intimate gesture. "That was," she began, her voice trailing off as she searched for the right words. "Unexpected," Frank offered, a faint smirk playing at his lips. "Unexpected," she agreed, though there was no regret in her tone. Frank chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Guess we'll figure this out as we go." Zeril smiled, her violet eyes glimmering with something close to happiness. "I guess we will." The night stretched on, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Zeril didn't feel alone. The morning air was thick with the smell of charred wood and damp earth. The settlement felt subdued, the usual hum of quiet activity replaced by hushed voices and wary glances. Frank stood outside the shack, scanning the horizon as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky in muted hues of pink and gold. He felt the weight of something unspoken pressing against his chest, as if the air itself carried the tension of things left unsaid. Inside, Zeril braided Vaxel's dark hair, her hands working methodically while her mind raced. The events of the past few days had shifted something within her, both in her perception of Frank and her understanding of the world she thought she knew. She tightened the braids slightly, and Vaxel winced. "Mama, that hurts," the little girl protested, twisting to look up at her. "Sorry, my love," Zeril murmured, loosening her grip. She finished quickly and kissed Vaxel's forehead, though her thoughts remained distant. When Frank entered, Vaxel's face lit up. "Frank, look at my braid," she exclaimed, spinning around to show him. He crouched slightly, examining it with mock seriousness. "Looks good. Sturdy. Won't come undone when you're out there saving the world." Vaxel giggled, a sound that seemed to momentarily lift the heavy atmosphere in the room. But Zeril's eyes stayed fixed on Frank, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said finally, her tone firm but quiet. Frank straightened, his brow furrowing. "What's on your mind?" The two of them stepped outside, leaving Vaxel playing contentedly on the floor. The early light reflected off the metallic fragments scattered around the shack, casting faint, fractured shadows on the ground. Zeril turned to Frank, her frills quivering slightly, a tell he was beginning to recognize as nervousness. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice low. "The fire, the rumors about sabotage, the way the overseers are acting. It doesn't feel like coincidence. Frank crossed his arms, his posture guarded but attentive. You think someone set the fire on purpose? I don't just think it, she replied. I know it. Frank raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharpening. And you're just telling me this now? I couldn't be sure before, Zeril admitted. But I overheard something yesterday, something I think you need to hear. She hesitated, glancing toward the settlement before continuing. One of the overseers, Artek, was arguing with another. They mentioned the biofiber panels failing faster than expected. But it wasn't just an accident. Artek said something about orders. About following instructions to clear the way. Clear the way for what? Frank asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. I don't know, Zeril said, her tone tight with frustration. But it sounded calculated. Frank's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information they had. If someone's trying to sabotage this place, they're not just burning homes for fun. They're clearing space for something or someone. Zeril nodded, her expression grim. And they don't care who gets hurt in the process. The rest of the morning passed in tense silence as the two of them debated their next move. Frank wanted to confront Artek directly, but Zeril urged caution. If he's involved, he won't just admit it, she said. And if he feels cornered, he might do something worse. Reluctantly, Frank agreed. We'll need proof, he said. Something solid to show the others. Otherwise, it's our word against his. They decided to investigate the ruins of the burned pods, hoping to find evidence of tampering. Zeril left Vaxel in the care of a neighbor, one of the few who still spoke to her, and the two set off toward the charred remains of their former home. The wreckage was worse than Frank had anticipated. The ground was littered with scorched fragments of biofiber, twisted metal frames, and piles of ash that still reeked of smoke. He crouched beside a partially collapsed wall, inspecting the blackened edges with a critical eye. This doesn't add up, he muttered, running his fingers along the brittle surface. Biofiber's supposed to resist this kind of heat. It's designed to self-extinguish. Zeril knelt beside him, her frills twitching. What are you saying? I'm saying someone made sure this stuff burned, Frank replied. He held up a piece of the material, his expression dark. See this residue? It's a chemical accelerant. Something flammable got into the walls. Zeril's breath caught. They sabotaged the pods. Frank nodded. And whoever did it didn't care how many people were inside. As they continued searching, Zeril found a small, twisted device buried under a layer of ash. She held it up to Frank, her violet eyes narrowing. What is this? Frank took it from her, turning it over in his hands. The device was sleek but damaged, its edges scorched and its inner mechanisms exposed. He recognized it immediately. A timer used to ignite fires remotely. It's a trigger, he said, his voice tight. Whoever set this up wanted to make sure it went off at just the right time. Zeril's stomach churned. This is more than sabotage. This is murder. They returned to the settlement under the weight of their discovery, their minds racing with questions and possibilities. Zeril insisted they keep the evidence hidden until they had a plan, but Frank's instincts told him time was running out. When they reached the shack, Vaxel greeted them with her usual bright smile, unaware of the storm brewing around her. Zeril hugged her tightly, unable to shake the fear that had taken root in her chest. That evening, as the three of them sat together, the tension between Frank and Zeril shifted. The weight of what they had uncovered pressed them closer, their shared purpose creating a fragile but undeniable bond. When Vaxel drifted off to sleep, Zeril turned to Frank, her voice trembling with quiet resolve. Whatever's coming, we face it together. Frank met her gaze, his blue eyes steady. You're damn right we do. But as he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. Whatever truth they uncovered, it would come at a cost. And Frank wasn't sure if any of them were ready to pay it. The morning air was thick with the smell of charred wood and damp earth. The settlement felt subdued, the usual hum of quiet activity replaced by hushed voices and wary glances. Frank stood outside the shack, scanning the horizon as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky in muted hues of pink and gold. He felt the weight of something unspoken pressing against his chest, as if the air itself carried the tension of things left unsaid. Inside, Zeril braided Vaxel's dark hair, her hands working methodically while her mind raced. The events of the past few days had shifted something within her, both in her perception of Frank and her understanding of the world she thought she knew. She tightened the braids slightly, and Vaxel winced. "Mama, that hurts," the little girl protested, twisting to look up at her. "Sorry, my love," Zeril murmured, loosening her grip. She finished quickly and kissed Vaxel's forehead, though her thoughts remained distant. When Frank entered, Vaxel's face lit up. "Frank, look at my braid," she exclaimed, spinning around to show him. He crouched slightly, examining it with mock seriousness. "Looks good. Sturdy. Won't come undone when you're out there saving the world." Vaxel giggled, a sound that seemed to momentarily lift the heavy atmosphere in the room. But Zeril's eyes stayed fixed on Frank, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said finally, her tone firm but quiet. Frank straightened, his brow furrowing. "What's on your mind?" The two of them stepped outside, leaving Vaxel playing contentedly on the floor. The early light reflected off the metallic fragments scattered around the shack, casting faint, fractured shadows on the ground. Zeril turned to Frank, her frills quivering slightly, a tell he was beginning to recognize as nervousness. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice low. "The fire, the rumors about sabotage, the way the overseers are acting. It doesn't feel like coincidence." Frank crossed his arms, his posture guarded but attentive. "You think someone set the fire on purpose?" "I don't just think it," she replied. "I know it." Frank raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharpening. "And you're just telling me this now?" "I couldn't be sure before," Zeril admitted. "But I overheard something yesterday, something I think you need to hear." She hesitated, glancing toward the settlement before continuing. One of the overseers, Artek, was arguing with another. They mentioned the biofiber panels failing faster than expected. But it wasn't just an accident. Artek said something about orders, about following instructions to clear the way. "Clear the way for what?" Frank asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "I don't know," Zeril said, her tone tight with frustration. But it sounded calculated. Frank's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information they had. If someone's trying to sabotage this place, they're not just burning homes for fun. They're clearing space for something or someone. Zeril nodded, her expression grim. And they don't care who gets hurt in the process. The rest of the morning passed in tense silence as the two of them debated their next move. Frank wanted to confront Artek directly, but Zeril urged caution. "If he's involved, he won't just admit it," she said. "And if he feels cornered, he might do something worse." Reluctantly, Frank agreed. "We'll need proof," he said. "Something solid to show the others. Otherwise, it's our word against his." They decided to investigate the ruins of the burned pods, hoping to find evidence of tampering. Zeril left Vaxel in the care of a neighbor, one of the few who still spoke to her, and the two set off toward the charred remains of their former home. The wreckage was worse than Frank had anticipated. The ground was littered with scorched fragments of biofiber, twisted metal frames, and piles of ash that still reeked of smoke. He crouched beside a partially collapsed wall, inspecting the blackened edges with a critical eye. "This doesn't add up," he muttered, running his fingers along the brittle surface. "Biofiber's supposed to resist this kind of heat. It's designed to self-extinguish." Zeril knelt beside him, her frills twitching. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying someone made sure this stuff burned," Frank replied. He held up a piece of the material, his expression dark. "See this residue? It's a chemical accelerant. Something flammable got into the walls." Zeril's breath caught. "They sabotaged the pods." Frank nodded. "And whoever did it didn't care how many people were inside." As they continued searching, Zeril found a small, twisted device buried under a layer of ash. She held it up to Frank, her violet eyes narrowing. "What is this?" Frank took it from her, turning it over in his hands. The device was sleek but damaged, its edges scorched and its inner mechanisms exposed. He recognized it immediately, a timer used to ignite fires remotely. "It's a trigger," he said, his voice tight. "Whoever set this up wanted to make sure it went off at just the right time." Zeril's stomach churned. This is more than sabotage. This is murder. They returned to the settlement under the weight of their discovery, their minds racing with questions and possibilities. Zeril insisted they keep the evidence hidden until they had a plan, but Frank's instincts told him time was running out. When they reached the shack, Vaxel greeted them with her usual bright smile, unaware of the storm brewing around her. Zeril hugged her tightly, unable to shake the fear that had taken root in her chest. That evening, as the three of them sat together, the tension between Frank and Zeril shifted. The weight of what they had uncovered pressed them closer, their shared purpose creating a fragile but undeniable bond. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting the settlement in a warm, amber glow. The air, heavy with the scent of scorched earth, carried a tense stillness, as if the world itself held its breath. Frank and Zeril stood near the central square, the small device clutched in Frank's hand, the undeniable proof of sabotage. "We have to confront him now," Frank said, his voice low but firm. His piercing blue eyes swept the square, where a few Gorvanians lingered, their frills twitching with unease. Zeril nodded, though her frills quivered with apprehension. "If Artek's involved, he won't go quietly. And if he has others working with him, then we deal with it," Frank interrupted. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We've come this far. No turning back." She drew a steadying breath, her gaze shifting to Vaxel, who played nearby with a group of children. For her daughter's sake, she couldn't falter now. The overseer's chamber was an unassuming structure, its rounded walls made of reinforced biofiber that gleamed faintly under the settlement's artificial lights. Frank and Zeril entered, their footsteps echoing in the hollow space. Artek stood at a central console, his back to them, his frills twitching as he manipulated a holographic display. "Artek," Zeril called, her voice strong despite her nerves. The overseer turned, his expression carefully neutral. "Zeril, Frank, to what do I owe this visit?" Frank stepped forward, his imposing frame dominating the room. He held up the twisted device, his expression hard. "Found this in the wreckage. Care to explain?" Artek's frills stiffened, but his expression remained calm. "A damaged device. Hardly unusual in the aftermath of such destruction." Frank's lips curved into a grim smile. "Funny thing is, it's not just damaged. It's a trigger. Someone used this to start the fire." A flicker of unease crossed Artek's face, but he quickly recovered. "That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation," Zeril said, stepping forward. "It's the truth. We overheard you. Clearing the way." "What were you talking about? Artek? What's worth killing for?" Artek's composure cracked. His frills flared briefly before he composed himself. "You don't understand. This settlement is failing. The biofiber we use is degrading faster than it should. Supplies are scarce. If we don't act, everyone here will suffer." "So your solution was to destroy people's homes?" Frank growled, his fists clenching. "To force them out?" Artek straightened, his tone turning defensive. "It wasn't my choice. The higher council ordered it. They believe reducing the population will conserve resources. The fire was unfortunate but necessary." Zeril's eyes widened, her body trembling with rage. "Unfortunate? My child almost died. People lost everything. How can you justify that?" Artek's gaze shifted, guilt creeping into his expression. "You think I wanted this? I argued against it, but the council overruled me. I had no choice." Frank stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You always have a choice. You just didn't have the spine to make the right one." Artek's frills flattened. "What would you have me do, human? Let the entire settlement collapse?" Frank didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Zeril, his expression softening. "What happens now is up to you." By the time they left the overseer's chamber, the truth had spread through the settlement. Word of the council's cold calculations and Artek's complicity ignited a storm of anger among the Gorvanians. For a society that prized harmony, the revelation was a harsh wake-up call. Zeril stood at the center of the square, her voice steady as she addressed the gathered crowd. "We've been told this settlement is failing, that sacrifices are necessary. But those decisions were made without our knowledge, without our consent. We deserve better than this." The crowd murmured in agreement, their frills rising in solidarity. Frank stood at her side, his presence a silent but powerful reassurance. We rebuild, Zero continued, not just our homes, but our trust in each other. No more secrets, no more lives lost for the sake of convenience. The Gorvanians responded with a collective hum of approval, their unity slowly reforging in the face of adversity. Later that night, the settlement was quiet. Frank sat outside the shack, staring at the horizon as the twin moons cast their silvery light across the landscape. The weight of the day's events hung heavy in his chest, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope for this place. Zeril joined him, her footsteps light against the packed dirt. She sat beside him, the silence between them comfortable. "You did a lot today," she said softly. "More than anyone expected." Frank shook his head. "You're the one who stood in front of all those people. You're the one they listened to." "Because of you," Zeril replied, her lavender eyes meeting his. "You gave me the courage to speak." Frank glanced at her, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "You didn't need me for that. You've had it in you all along." They sat in silence for a moment, the night air cool against their skin. Then, tentatively, Zeril reached out, her hand brushing against his. Frank didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm glad you're here." Frank smiled, a rare and genuine expression. "Me too." As the moons continued their slow arc across the sky, the shack stood as a small but steady beacon of resilience. Inside, Vaxel slept soundly, her dreams untroubled for the first time in days. Outside, two unlikely allies sat hand in hand, their bond forged in fire and strengthened by trust. For the first time in what felt like forever, the future didn't seem so uncertain. Together, they would face whatever came next.